How do expectations shift your experience of a game? Why is it that some games do better when they break convention, while other games feel like a betrayal? Why do players celebrate some games for being different, but condemn others for being the same? If a game is part of a beloved series but it abandons conventions that its audience associate with its identity, fans condemn it, or worse, disown it entirely. This often occurs where nostalgia is involved. Breaking genre expectations here often feels like sacrilege. On the other hand, there are also the personal assumptions that a gamer would have with the kind of games that we think we're signing up for. If you start a Metroidvania, you know to expect a sprawling map with non-linear platforming. But what happens when a game becomes far more demanding or time-consuming than you budgeted for? In April 2026, I played 2 games that changed how I think about expectations and assumptions. I found myself completely opposite to wider agreed gaming consensus. The game I was supposed to love left me exhausted, while the game that I was supposed to hate left me charmed and refreshed with a smile on my face. The truth is that my experience was shaped by false assumptions that I brought into the games that I played. I was punished by one game for my ignorance, while the other turned it into genuine enjoyment. The core theme here was ignorance, of the games I played, of their history and their wider community and franchise impact. This fundamentally changed my experience and made me realise that our assumptions, both true and false, can completely shift how you perceive a game, almost to the point of overriding the game's actual objective quality. In April 2026, I played through Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, a game beloved by audiences and critics. A game that exists purely through the admirable passion of fans and industry experts joining together to revive a genre that was in great need of innovation. It was a game that kept every promise it made, to the joy and elation of lifelong Castlevania fans. Despite all of this sentiment surrounding the game, I hated it. On the flip side, I also played StarFox Adventures, a game that divided the StarFox fanbase and is widely ridiculed in YouTube video essays for its betrayal of a formula. Widely regarded, if not as a stain on the franchise, at least the awkward step-sibling of the IP that doesn't get invited to parties. This game broke the promise that StarFox as a franchise makes to its audience and is maligned for breaking from its genre. Despite that cold fan reception, I loved it. My problems with Bloodstained were my own fault, and I want to be completely transparent about that. But if I knew that there was a full-on action RPG involved here, I probably would have come to this game with an approach befitting its nature. I went in expecting a Metroidvania like Hollow Knight and was punished with a grindy RPG that left me totally exhausted. It was just so much more than I had bargained for. In contrast, StarFox Adventures at its core is a linear, early 3D Zelda-style adventure game, and that design lends itself extremely well to just a pick-up-and-play approach. Being ignorant to the franchise expectations allowed me to look at this title for its own merits. I wasn't punished for expecting space combat. Instead, I was rewarded with a light-hearted, passionately crafted adventure game, one that kept me engaged throughout. Because of its engaging but linear narrative which stuck to the basics, I was left satisfied and joyful for my experience. So ignorance made StarFox Adventures a better experience for me because I wasn't bogged down by the fact that it departed from its series. But that very ignorance made Bloodstained feel like an ordeal, and a worse experience because I simply wasn't expecting to grind for dozens of hours. One punished my lack of research, while the other was elevated by it. In the end, my views were the opposite of fan and internet consensus. With StarFox Adventures, my individual view was enjoyment, while it was condemned by the wider fanbase because it was unfaithful to its own brand. On the other hand, the game that I disliked, Bloodstained, was widely beloved by the fans because it was faithful to Castlevania. So with all of this preamble out the way, let's get into my experience of playing these games in April 2026 and begin to answer the questions of how expectations and mindsets shape your gaming reality, beginning with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Having played 6 games in March, I was now ready to try to commit to something a little bit longer term, and I was eager to try another game outside of the typical comfort zone I had established, with most of my titles at this point being first-person shooters and nostalgic 3D platformers. I picked Bloodstained out of my Steam library thinking that I would love to get into a good, medium-length Metroidvania. I thought it would be perfectly placed to add some flavour and depth to my games played in 2026, but I hadn't bargained for just how deep things would go with this game. As it turned out, I was in for one hell of a journey. I went into Bloodstained with the expectation set as a false understanding of what kind of Metroidvania it actually was. My only experience of the genre to this point had been Hollow Knight, which is a once-in-a-generation masterpiece of mythical proportions. As I learned after the fact, this game was made as a faithful successor to Castlevania. I'm not familiar with the series, but apparently that means levelling up and grinding mechanics. It's basically a JRPG grafted onto the bones of a 2D platformer, with the kind of layers and depth that implies. This initial surprise made me wary at first, but I decided to press on with Bloodstained thanks to renewed energy, given that it was the first game of the month. Then I reached the point in the game where the shops and crafting system opened up, and I realised that this game would be taking up most of my life for at least the next 2 weeks. There was a cooking system, a way to buy ingredients, equipment purchases, a levelling system, all of which felt deeper than the Mariana Trench. Don't get me wrong, in another contest this would be attractive as hell. There were so many opportunities to synergise these systems and create a sense of incredible strategic payoff. However, when you're trying to roll credits on games quickly and move on to the next one, I was already feeling kind of itchy by the time these systems revealed themselves, conscious that I needed to move on to the next game as soon as possible to maintain my gaming momentum. I don't know what it was that kept me going, probably a sense of stubbornness, but I pushed forward anyway despite already having a sense that I was not in the right headspace to accept Bloodstained. When I finally realised that this wasn't for me, unfortunately it was far too late to actually throw in the towel. By the time that I was ready to end things with Bloodstained, I was already halfway into my second week of April. If I was going to have something to show for the time I pumped into this game, I had to just suck it up and push through. The sunk cost fallacy had bitten me hard. It's a shame though that I wasn't able to meet Bloodstained on the right terms, because as a game, all the pieces are assembled beautifully. This game was designed by Koji Igarashi, a legendary developer famous for being one of the greater creative forces behind the Castlevania series. This pedigree shows through in every dense layer of the game, put together with a passion and love rarely equalled in gaming as a whole. As an action RPG, the stylings are excellent when you can get into it. Toward the end, I was able to finally grind a few shards to being actually worth using, and then the power fantasy started to go through the roof. The issue for me simply was that I was not prepared for a grindy game of this scale. I had severe discomfort navigating the menus and realising the sheer scale and density of information that I would have to wrap my head around. There were numerous character stats and trade-offs with equipment that I would have to min-max within an inch of my life to survive. Plus, the overall level of quality of life with these systems leaves a lot to be desired. The cooking system amounts to going between 3 screens to buy needed ingredients, and there's a constant back and forth between each shop, because there's no way to pin or otherwise be able to recall at a moment's notice what you need for each recipe. When you're in the shop menu you can't access the cooking menu and vice versa. On top of that, the grinding nature often works against itself in a way that is deeply frustrating. Whenever I met a hard boss that beat me, I would often have to look up the strategy to find that I needed to grind a particular shard so I could have an easier time. The issue? The materials to grind said shard were often gated in rooms after the boss that I was having trouble with. This occurred at least 3 or 4 times during my playthrough. The pacing is really strange too. The first major boss that you fight in the castle is a brutal boss, harder than literally every other fight in the game. It requires incredible reflexes and skills to dart back and forth in an arena, with movement so sluggish that Miriam here could be mistaken for a snail. This pacing also has issues when it comes to unlocking abilities. One of the greatest joys in a Metroidvania is having areas locked off by currently impossible jumps, leaving you wondering when you can unlock the abilities to navigate to those points. But Bloodstained just leaned on this design aspect a little too much to the point it became more of an eye-rolling annoyance than a tantalising tease of your future, as in other games of this style. That said, I recognise this is all part of the joy of a Castlevania title. I looked up videos of Symphony of the Night, and I do see the appeal of this kind of gameplay with dense mechanics and grinding. It's perfect for a player looking to become totally immersed into the world of the game. For what it's worth, Bloodstained is an exceptional Castlevania title. It's just that I was not looking for a game to be quite this deep, involved and grinding based. My failure to distinguish the kind of Metroidvania that this title was meant that I was met with a game that just did not provide the experience that I wanted. I was hoping for a deep, exploratory platformer based on skills and pure reaction time and movement mastery, not an RPG. The issue is also that Bloodstained has an unsatisfying basic ending. Under circumstances like this, I would have normally just focused on doing just enough to roll credits, even if that meant that the ending I got was unsatisfying. However, the game doesn't even give me that satisfaction without a full investment. The credits roll is locked behind the true ending, which is in itself an extra 12 hours minimum away by the time you reach the end of the main game. A straightforward final boss beating results in not even an ending, but a game over screen. So I couldn't even find a jumping off point. Bloodstained wants its players to go all in. I found myself tearing at what was left of the hairs on my shining bald head as I went through what was supposed to be post-endgame and found new area after new area, finding that I had barely even experienced half of what the game had to offer. Despite beating its boss, it forced me to double down for even longer. I got a real sense of, come on, time to wrap this up now, only to find another, secret, location that would take me another 2 to 3 hours to explore. In another time, I would have greatly appreciated Bloodstained for being a sprawling, insanely detailed world with incredible power fantasy mechanics that I could grind for hours, with multiple systems I could sink my teeth into, and a way to optimise and min-max synergising gameplay mechanics in a way that rivals my favourite action RPGs. But at its core, the issue was that I didn't want that out of Bloodstained. Because my expectations failed me with my false understanding of the game going in, I had a bad time with this game. It goes to show my point that expectations can dramatically shift the context of how you can enjoy a game. On paper, Bloodstained should be a 10 out of 10 absolute win for me, especially with my mindset of bang for your buck in terms of hours of gameplay, but fundamentally it fails because I wasn't ready to appreciate the game the way that it deserved. That said, I can recognise Bloodstained is an excellent title and a standout Castlevania successor. Its systems are dense, rewarding and clearly built with enormous affection for the formula. It's just geared towards a particular type of player that wasn't me when I played it. But for Castlevania fans, they rightfully adore Bloodstained and it's easy to see why. It met their every desire and exceeded every single one. It deserves accolades and recognition for delivering exactly what was promised. It's just a shame that I was not able to appreciate that promise. For the purposes of my experiment and the spreadsheet that I'm keeping, Bloodstained Ritual of Night gets a 4 out of 10 from me. But I do feel compelled to emphasise that this is a personal rating, but not an objective one. In another universe, this would have become one of my absolute favourites. But games don't exist in a vacuum, and I wasn't ready to meet Bloodstained with the investment that it truly deserved. After being mentally broken down by Bloodstained, I found myself craving to revisit a nostalgic title. I landed on StarFox Adventures. It's totally a neat coincidence that I found myself attracted to this game in April, only for the franchise as a whole to resurface again in a major way in the time since I played. Now I'm not saying I personally manifested Star Fox's return, but you're welcome. I picked this game also because thematically it made the most sense. I had just finished Bloodstained, a game where the fans adored it and I hated it precisely for how it met and exceeded every expectation placed upon it. And now I decided to examine why I loved Star Fox Adventures, a game which I adored but which divided fans because of how it completely ignored those expectations. Let's be honest, it's not even remotely close to a real Star Fox game. My initial expectation of this game was nothing actually. As a young gamer, I had never actually had any experience of the overall franchise, and the subsequent conventions and expectations that came from the nostalgia of its name. Actually, my grandmother bought me this game after visiting my great-grandmother in hospital during a decline in her health. I remember she was giving it to me as a way to cheer me up afterwards, and as a result I had a joyful, comforting experience with a fun GameCube adventure game. A Zelda-like experience with a world that was wholly pleasant to escape into for a little while. Because I didn't know much about Star Fox as its own franchise, the game that I was greeted with was a blast to play. I learned much later, thanks to its time being roasted by various YouTube reviewers as a maligned title, that Adventures was not just a significant departure from the formula of its franchise, but it practically had nothing in common with it, except that Rare had forcefully grafted the IP onto a completely separate video game they were making called Dinosaur Planet. It actually turns out that the critical consensus on Adventures is that it's a great game in its own right, if you ignore the Star Fox branding. So I was perfectly placed to receive this game as someone who had no real emotional attachment whatsoever to the franchise up until this point. Revisiting it in 2026, I'm going through some personal grief, something that I will make a topic of a later video when I'm ready. But for now, let's just say I needed the emotional comfort blanket that I associate with Star Fox Adventures. Going back to the core of this game and its expectations, having already played it, this time I knew what to expect. I went in knowing what I wanted to get from this game. The thing about Star Fox Adventures is that the game often got ignored for its qualities as an adventure game because of the genre pedigree of its franchise. As online criticism matured, more people started to evaluate the game on its own merits rather than its betrayal. As an adventure game then, I can candidly say this game is a flawed masterpiece. The main reason it stands up so well today for me is quite simple. The world is eye-wateringly gorgeous. Not just in a graphic sense, which is something I will address because, damn, this game is astonishing, but in an aesthetic sense. At the core of it, Dinosaur Planet is just a place where you want to be. The lush green of Thorntail Hollow, the crystal clear waters of Cape Claw, even the frigid Snowhorn Waste, practically every setting that this game has to offer has an incredible sense of place, and beyond that, natural beauty that leaves you wishing that this location was a real place that you could live. There are some areas that the game does fail significantly. The voice acting is questionable at best, especially in sections where the dinosaur language is used in an excessive amount. It's been memed a fair amount to this point, but the use of the language just brings out the worst in the voice acting here, to the point of downright cringe. Even as a child, with my lower expectations of video game storytelling and voice acting, I used to have to mute the volume in these moments because it was just painful to listen to.
What?
We all know the story that this was a Rare developed title originally under the name of Dinosaur Planet. I actually highly recommend that you look up videos which go deeper into this original design. It's a fascinating world in its own right, and it's a huge shame thinking what might have been if the developers involved would have been allowed to stick to their original plans for the project. As a whole though, because I didn't have the expectation of a Star Fox game, I got to assess this game on its merits as pure adventure, no baggage attached, and here the game really is just a great example of its genre. It doesn't even come close to reaching the heights of Ocarina of Time by any means, but the fact it's even in the room means it's of a quality worth turning your head for. When I'm looking at a game like this specifically, I'm placing less emphasis on the gameplay, because even in the early days of 2002, an adventure game like this, it was largely a solved equation. The core loop is linear progression where ability upgrades allow you to progress across a 3D world, but with the storyline and cutscenes urging you onwards and hinting you to the next puzzle piece of the overall plot. There's nothing new here. That said, there are some innovations, primarily with how the game provides you with a sidekick, Tricky, to order around and solve puzzle. It largely takes the form of basic dog training like commands like heal and stay, but Tricky's main attraction is puzzle solving, using his flame ability in interesting set pieces. The puzzles themselves are simple enough, they're linear brain teasers, they're nothing too strenuous. It's more of a gentle hike than a mountain climb. The biggest challenge with the puzzles is figuring out what order you need to do them in, not the puzzles themselves. Tricky nonetheless proves to be a valuable companion that on some level I wound up caring about by the end of the game. However, what truly sets apart a game in the adventure genre is how does the world look and feel? Is this a place you want to visit, and are these characters people you want to spend time with? And that is a resounding yes from me. I've already mentioned the graphics, but I want to place emphasis on the overall sense of place that you get from this game. There are multiple biomes on show, each of which look great in their own way. You get a real sense of adventuring across a planet with all kinds of different varied locales that all look so unique from one another. There's a real sense of satisfaction from merely travelling across Dinosaur Planet. The characters are generally your standard stereotypes, but here there is value in saying that although they're cliché, there's sometimes a value to just playing your tropes straight. The Snowhorn are standouts here. Their characters play off the physicality of being a tribe of large, wise creatures with a gentle slowness in their mannerisms, and it endears them to the player. On the other hand, the Fawntail themselves are the dinosaurs that you spend the most of your time with, and they're generally fun to talk to and engage with. They're playful, carefree, and often humorous. They're the hobbits of the Dinosaur Planet world, content to live peaceful lives in their valley, a great companion to the cozy vibe and aesthetic that this game achieves. By the end of my time with Star Fox Adventures, I didn't want to leave. I had grown to love this gorgeous world with its varied environments, whimsical characters, and fantastical lush scenery.
Ah, a lovely sweetie.
I think the main thing that sets this game apart from Bloodstained is that it's not mechanically dense, but it's instead emotionally nourishing. Against my own initial expectations of it as a child, Star Fox exceeded all the bars that I had set for it, simply because those bars didn't exist, and it was simplistic enough in its design that it benefited from that non-existent expectation. Additionally, we do need to address the Earthwalker in the room, which is that this game was sold as a Star Fox game. As far as fan expectations go, that sets the bar pretty high. The franchise was founded as an on-rails space shoot-'em-up, and the only time the game even remotely approaches that is during shoehorned in, blink and you miss 'em segments which transition you between levels. I can understand why this would be a kick in the teeth to fans of the IP that felt starved of Star Fox as a franchise at this point when the game was released. If I was such a fan, this would feel sacrilegious, bordering on almost offensive. To be greeted with what amounts to a competently made Zelda clone, I can appreciate that this game would be disliked within its series context. Adventures was never meant to be a Star Fox game, and this much is plainly obvious with even the tiniest bit of research. As mentioned before, this game was originally Dinosaur Planet, and it showed incredible promise as Rare's answer to Zelda. Even today, that original DNA is shining through in a way that I find myself wishing that it was brave enough to fly on its own without riding in the shadow of a Star Fox R-Wing. If it were allowed to breathe as its own IP, would the fan reception have been warm enough to allow sequels, or even for this to become a series in its own right? Would Dinosaur Planet be spoken of with just as, if not more warmth, than the Star Fox brand as a whole? That's something we'll never know. Nonetheless, the fans expected a Star Fox game, and they didn't get one. On a fundamental level, that is why this game was severely disliked in its time. However, even the fans of the series have begun to recognise that there is an exceptional title buried under the shoehorned in IP here. That explains why I, as someone who didn't have any expectations, enjoyed this game so much, and why Adventures comes off so well to reward my ignorance. Without that burden of expectations, Star Fox Adventures is a lovable, endearing title where, in contrast to Bloodstained, my ignorance allowed me to give this game the respect and investment it deserved. And unlike Bloodstained, StarFox doesn't demand hours of optimization and time sink grinding. Instead of asking for that investment from me, StarFox merely invites me to stay in its world and gives me reasons to stick around. It doesn't overstay its welcome by any means, and it's content to provide a simple, straightforward adventuring experience, leaving me satisfied. If Bloodstained is a 12-course, high-cuisine masterpiece, StarFox Adventures is a rustic dish of comforting home cooking. And that's the reason why StarFox Adventures is a 7 out of 10. Traditional gamer consensus would tell you that Bloodstained is by far the superior game, and I understand why. Had I met the game on its own terms, its mechanical richness and ambition and the affection for Castlevania as a formula would have placed it as a top favourite of my library. StarFox Adventures is the opposite side of the spectrum. It's simpler but more uneven, and it's not even really a StarFox game at all. But because I met it without those expectations, its quirks became endearing rather than alienating. So neither game truly reflected their objective quality here, but instead how they fit with me in the context of how I experienced them. That was the real lesson that I learned in April. Games don't exist in a vacuum. Rather, they are informed by emotional investment, the player's state when they experience the game. That state is so powerful that it can often be the deciding factor of whether a game becomes a timeless classic or a disappointment. Meeting a game the right way in the right time can make all the difference, and the context of how we experience a game can shape our experience more powerfully than objective quality ever could.